It's time to take a new approach to finding true fulfillment in your career, health, and state of mind through insightful conversations with those who have found their professional and personal passions while achieving balance. Whether it's entrepreneurs, athletes, or healthcare professionals, we bring you real people, real growth right here on the Boost Podcast. Now, here's your host, Elena Lipson.
Hey Boost Squad, and welcome to episode 19. Elena Lipson here, and I can't wait to introduce today's featured guest, Patrick Freuler. Patrick, are you ready to join the Boost Squad?
Absolutely. I'm very happy to be here.
Great.
So before we dive into today's episode, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Mosaic Growth Partners. Mosaic Growth Partners provides growth strategy consulting to entrepreneurs and organizations in the healthcare and older adult baby boomer market. They can help you bring a new product or service to market, identify and engage new customers and partners, or grow your market share. They also provide coaching and training. For more information, go to mosaicgrowth.com. That's mosaicgrowth.com. Now back to today's featured guest.
So Patrick is the founder and CEO of Audicus, which offers high-tech, affordable hearing aids by selling them online. And Audicus is really changing the way we diagnose and treat hearing loss by providing remote hearing test solutions, which they do by offering free hearing test apps on desktops and iOS. And this practice is really disrupting the industry. In fact, it's so disruptive that Audicus has become the leading e-commerce retailer of hearing aids and has saved consumers more than $30 million to date. On top of that, just a few weeks ago, Richard was pitching to Sir Richard Branson on Necker Island with just a handful of companies in the Extreme Tech Challenge. Patrick was born in Switzerland, but he was raised in and went to school in Brazil and Amsterdam. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree in aerospace engineering from MIT. And before Audicus, he worked as a private equity healthcare investor at Bain Capital and a strategy consultant at McKinsey. So lots to talk about here with you today, Patrick, and lots to learn. So let's just get started. What are the three things that we should know about Audicus?
Firstly, many thanks for this super kind introduction. The three things everyone should know about Audicus is that first and foremost, we're really building a groundbreaking new solution for hearing loss that really puts the consumer at the center, right? We're building a solution that's all about you, that is completely online. It's very seamless and very, very affordable. So that's the first takeaway. We're really streamlining the hearing aid and acquisition process. The second thing people should know about Audicus is that we're really having a tremendous social impact, right? It's not only the affordability that we've been generating through our model and really democratizing access to hearing care, but it's also like the incredible impact of our hearing aid donation program that we've launched only a year and a half ago. So by now, we're able to really transform tens of thousands of lives. Okay, that's lots of people that now can communicate more effectively with the world around them and really feel empowered to take healthcare back into their own hands, right? So the second point really is about social impact. The third aspect is really about the technological angle that we've been exploring, right? So over the last year or two, we kind of added a super important component to the hearing aid purchasing process, which is we started designing hearing diagnostic solutions or hearing tests that you can really do on your own, either through a mobile application or through a simple web browser, okay? So essentially, these types of hearing applications allow you to get a pretty good read on, where you stand in terms of your hearing loss spectrum and then take the necessary next steps in terms of addressing it. And so our really big stab here is to create a solution that gives people just a far, far better and cheaper and far more seamless understanding on their health conditions. And so that solution, the diagnostic, is something that will eventually live not only on mobile and web, but we hope that we can start launching this in a physical format inside of actual retail stores, clinics, and other retail locations. So, our big vision here is really to ultimately make hearing care ubiquitous, okay? In a very broad nutshell, the three big takeaways about our company.
Great. So I think, the average person probably doesn't know that much about the hearing industry. I've worked with you before, so I know that what you're doing is so revolutionary and so different. But I think it would help all of us if you gave us a little bit of a window into traditionally how the hearing industry works in terms of pricing and how consumers go and deal with hearing loss and where they typically and traditionally have gone to get hearing aids, and then kind of put that into the context of how what you're doing is so disruptive.
Of course, yeah, that's a very important context here. So, for starters, hearing loss is something that affects a lot of people. Okay. In the US, it affects about 35 million Americans. Now, the problem here is that right now, the only solution that is really available to that gigantic amount of people is a hearing aid. And hearing aids come with, number one, a very, very high price tag. So a hearing aid typically costs about $2,500 per ear. And secondly, hearing aids are typically sold through audiology clinics that are inherently a long and relatively tedious procedure, right, that you have to endure, and that ultimately come with a scare factor that makes a lot of people shy away from the product. Okay. There is thirdly a big stigma associated with hearing aids that people still have. In other words, people still think that hearing aids are big and clunky and make you look, old. And as a result, like the adoption rate, because of those three factors, has been very, very low. Okay, so in fact, it's only about 1 in 4 people in the US that have hearing loss actually own a hearing aid. So we wanted to really get a better understanding on why that was, right? And for starters, we wanted to really understand like why those products were so incredibly expensive, especially in light of, modern technology like, modern cell phones or tablets just being almost an order of magnitude, more affordable than a modern hearing aid. And so we kind of investigated this and really saw that, there are a huge amount of markups and margins that get baked into the final hearing aid price, right? Just to give you an idea, right now, hearing aids are made by manufacturers that obviously impose a margin on it. In fact, like the cost to make a hearing aid is roughly $100 to $150. And the manufacturer will impose a margin on it and sell it to an audiologist. So it's essentially the hearing care professional that will ultimately test your hearing and subsequently sell your hearing aid. Okay. And, it's really at this final stage of the hearing aid purchasing process at the audiology clinic where most of the markup occurs. Okay. In fact, that's when a product that typically costs hundreds of dollars suddenly becomes thousands of dollars. And, this is essentially the area where we as Audicus, we wanted to just take a completely new approach to and really start offering consumers an additional alternative to purchasing hearing aids. Okay. We really wanted to provide an alternative channel that was firstly far more convenient. So it would be completely online and subsequently not have the same amount of markups that a traditional channel has, which ultimately would lead to you being able to buy a hearing aid on Audicus for, say, $500 to $600 as opposed to $2,500. So it's a completely new and unorthodox way of taking care of your hearing loss that we felt was badly needed because consumers just didn't have enough choice. So that's essentially how we position ourselves in this broader context, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a really important point that I want to mention that you didn't mention was that hearing aids are not covered by insurance. So these are all out-of-pocket costs. So the fact that there's companies out there that can reduce the cost so significantly for consumers is really amazing and really needed. And you also talked to the stigma of this. And like I know people my age, I'm in my late 30s, who have hearing loss. They spent a lot of time when they were younger going to concerts or being in bands. And so this isn't just something that affects older people. And, I want to give my little PSA because I spend a lot of time working out in studios with loud music and I always wear earplugs and people make fun of me. But like, you guys should be wearing earplugs because once you have hearing loss, you really can't get it back. So just wanted to get that PSA out there.
Yeah.
But Patrick, so I'm sure the hearing industry was not happy when you started using this model and in some ways going around the audiologist and being able to cut into some of their margins. So I'm sure you faced some opposition and you were a startup. So how have you grown this business? Give us 3 tactics for how you've grown the business.
Yeah, so at the beginning, we thought we'd have like a huge amount of backlash and like, a bit of a more hostile response. But what we quickly found out was that we're actually competing in completely different or relatively different customer segments. Okay. What we soon found was that consumers that went to the audiologist tended to be, number one, older, and to some extent also have more pronounced hearing losses. And in many cases already were quite familiar with hearing aids. Okay. Now, our model was addressing a completely different type of customer segment in the sense that it was firstly a younger segment. So it's people from anywhere from the age of like 45 to, I would say, 70. Okay. So it's kind of the active baby boomer segment. And secondly, we're dealing with people that are more tech enabled and as a result are okay with looking for a personal care solution on their own. And so we kind of saw that we were kind of competing in two different customer segments. And, as a company, we were really seeing that we were able to address a market segment that audiologists were just not able to tap into just because it was way too expensive and way too cumbersome. So from that standpoint, like we felt that the backlash was a lot more limited. And in fact, we had a pretty decent win-win situation. So how did we grow the business? Well, we tapped into exactly this customer segment, right? The tech-enabled baby boomer. And the way we grew the company in the beginning was very much organic, right? We had so much exposure by the press because the model was very innovative. It was very, very new. And to some extent, it was really speaking to a condition that really affected a lot of people. So the press coverage that we got and ultimately the word of mouth that ensued from this really put us on the map. So that was the first thing that really helped us grow our business in the first couple of quarters. And then, as we learned about our consumers over the course of the first year, we were able to start tailoring marketing campaigns in a far more effective way, right? So, for instance, we soon thereafter started, for instance, putting together paid marketing campaigns on Google and on Facebook, and to some extent, we're really able to start scaling our exposure that way, right? So that was the second thing that helped us, learn even more about our customer segments and get even more specific. The third thing that ultimately allowed us to grow even further was the fact that we started to really invest in branding, right? We ultimately wanted to build a company that was all about connecting people, right? It was about bringing people together and letting them interact in a seamless and effective way, just the way they used to in the past, right? And so, we took this like pretty consumer-centric approach to branding where, it was about human connections. It was about empowerment, okay? It was about you being able to take healthcare decisions on your own, you able to educate yourself on your own on what's going on. And ultimately, have a drastic improvement in your quality of life with a very, very seamless experience, right? And so, you have to keep in mind that, there is, as you kind of cross the 60 to 70-year-old bracket, you're kind of like dealing with to some extent, you're dealing with health issues that make you feel like you're losing, control over your life, right? And then like to add to this, you go to the audiologist, okay, and you feel that the process there and the pricing there is something that you're not in control of, right? So all of a sudden you're being hit with a very, very high price point, okay? There is like all this process that's going on. And it kind of like further adds to this feeling of like lack of control. And so we really wanted to put the power back in the hands of the consumer and build this consumer brand on top of it. Okay. So from this standpoint, like it's a pretty kind of innovative positioning because when we started, I don't think there was like a new take at building, consumer digital health brands for this segment. And so we had to really learn a lot of these things from scratch, You also have to keep in mind that 5 years ago or 10 years ago, like the average 60-year-old was a very different person than the average 60-year-old of today. And as a result, you just have to speak to this audience in a very, very different way. So that's the third part, really building brand, which ultimately created a lot of word of mouth, which ultimately, helped us to really scale the business.
Great. So even though Patrick is talking about what he's done in what's traditionally been a pretty unsexy space, and that there hasn't been a lot of innovation in the hearing aid industry in a very, very long time, the things he's talking about can really be applied to any business. So he's talking about defining your customer segments, using organic growth and paid marketing, and then really focusing in on what that brand is and clearly communicating value proposition. And I want to talk a little bit more, Patrick, about how you've defined your customer segments and how you went about doing that. Because a lot of times I will see companies that develop a product and then they go out and look for a customer for it. So I think the fact that you really were clear about who you were targeting sets you up for success. And I want to hear a little bit about how you went about defining who that customer is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, at the beginning, frankly, like we had to get a good understanding on who the customer is as quickly as possible, right? So even before we launched, I had drafted surveys, okay, to kind of get a first pulse on who would be most susceptible to a model like this. And then like the first version of the site kind of like leveraged that survey data, right? But then like within a first like month or two or the first quarter, you start seeing a lot of inbound calls and a lot of questions, and like you can start tracking all this information that ultimately allows you to get a far more granular picture on who really needs the solution, right? And so I think what really allowed us to build something of value so rapidly was kind of the obsession we had with understanding who our customer segment was and really dissecting the data down to very detailed levels of granular detail. So that kind of like helped us to then further target, the most lucrative and like most interested segments for us. But then like, as you continue doing this, like you get all this data in, right? You can start creating the typical customer personas, right? So for instance, like nowadays we have really three types of people that visit our site, right? Firstly, it's people that have gone to the doctor or an audiologist and understand that they have a hearing loss. They understand that what that hearing loss looks like because they got tested, so they have a hearing test at hand. And in many cases, they already have owned hearing aids in the past, okay? But, they're knocking on your door because they have massive amounts of sticker shock, okay? They're asking themselves that there's got to be a more affordable and better solution out there. And, they show up at your doorstep with a fair amount of education, okay? So that's one segment. The second segment we have, okay, are people that are aware that they have some form of hearing loss, and they know this because it's not only themselves who notice it, but it's also because they have spouses and kids and grandkids and the social context that tells them that their hearing condition is not up to speed. But they're currently looking for like educational materials. They're trying to understand how to best make sense of this condition and how to best address it, right? And so we have a huge amount of visitors that are kind of in that bracket, okay? Then we have a third segment, which is a very, very important one, and I was almost alluding to it a few seconds ago, which is the influencer segment, okay? So it's basically people who maybe in our generation, Elena, that have parents and grandparents that have a hearing issue and that need to be taken care of. And so this influencer segment is hugely important to really catalyze the affected person to do something about it. At the end of the day, hearing loss is a condition that it's a social condition, right? It isolates people from each other. And as a result, there's always two to tango in that equation. And so these three segments that you were able to like crystallize from all this data ultimately need to be marketed to and talked to in very, very different ways, right? I mean, influencer segments, like, it's essentially someone who needs to pass on the message, right? Those people who are just in an educational kind of journey, you need to talk to them like just about very basic concepts like what is hearing loss and like, how is it caused and like, how is the progression of it, what types of hearing losses and like how do you best address it with which technology and by which types of solutions. And so the conversation is far more educational, right? And it's far more assisted. And, really the end result there should be that person ultimately goes to the doctor to get tested and really have a final diagnosis or does one of our own hearing checks. Okay. And obviously, like, that interaction is very, very specific. Now, those people who have sticker shock, they're already informed and they already know what they need. And as a result, you need to be able to talk intelligently about the products that we have and how it ties together with their context, So segmentation is hugely, hugely important. And, you have to get to the point there like as quickly as possible.
Yeah, thank you for all that detail, Patrick. I mean, I think it's very clear that you and your team have put a lot of time into really understanding who your different customer segments are and what their needs are. And that's something we can all take away and think about when we're starting a business or growing a business, that if you're trying to reach everyone, you're not going to do a good job really talking to anyone, because you have to be very targeted and specific about who your customer is and the problem that you're solving for them. So, Patrick, I want to shift gears a little bit. So, the previous positions that you held prior to going off on your own as a private equity healthcare investor at Bain, strategy consultant at McKinsey, for some people, that is the pinnacle of success. So what made you want to leave, working for those big prestigious organizations and go out on your own?
Well, that's a very good question. I think at the end of the day, like you kind of need to feel the entrepreneurial urge, right? You need to feel almost like a bit of a calling to want to build something on your own that you can shape on your own. And that is like, you can create your own teams, you can create your own vision, you can create your own processes. And that's ultimately something that like you don't get to the same extent if you work for an established corporation, right? A lot of these big companies, have their own set structures and own set hierarchies. And to some extent, the rate of change that you see in there is far more limited than when you're in a startup, right? You basically, in a startup, you're at the beginning, like we played with a lot of different ideas that, worked at the beginning and then had to be shifted very rapidly to be able to yield results until we hit the next milestone. And that's not just like, one division. It's the whole company that needs to kind of shift 90 degrees and do something else. And so having that flexibility and that that ability to just like shape the course of the company with more impact is something that drew me into it. At the end of the day, you have to make a professional decision that ultimately fulfills you, right? And makes you happy. And that's like a very personal question you have to ask yourself. It has almost less to do with prestige and so on, right? Because that wears off after your first couple of weeks at a startup. There's just way too much going on. And there's just it's a very, very, it's a very hands-on job that, only yields glory and prestige in very, very small and few situations, So you have to be very, very true to yourself as you kind of explore that entrepreneurial path.
Yep. And how long has it been since you went out on your own?
We launched like the current version of Audicus, I would say towards the fall of 2012. And actually it was like late summer of 2012. So we've been around for, a little over 4 years now.
Great. So tell us, in those past few years, has there been a time when you've stagnated or stopped making progress, and how you've turned that around?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we never really stopped making progress. It was more that the progress kind of slowed, So for instance, there were moments when we, for instance, wanted to give the product development, for instance, of our hearing diagnostic apps a real push, right? But for you to be able to do that, you have to invest in a full-time team. You have to invest in clinical trials. You have to invest in regulatory advisors. And so all of these things really cost capital, right? It costs money. And you need to make these types of investments now that may only pay off in a year or two or even, a lengthier time frame. And so what I'm saying is that during these patches, where you're as a startup, you're just very, very resource constrained and you don't have the funding to invest gargantuan amounts into fast-paced development. Okay. That's when the progress slows and you have to make a dinner with nothing in the fridge, basically, and that's where you just have to get very, very creative on whom you work with and how you find the right answers with a very, very limited budget. So I think that's kind of what comes to mind right now. There's been periods in the company where, for instance, it felt like we were working really, really hard on things that were happening behind the curtains, but that did not directly impact our sales, right? And so, for instance, last year was one of those years where we spent a huge amount of energy and bandwidth in, for instance, overhauling our internal systems, right? I mean, we have a very complex process in educating consumers. And so we had to put the right platforms in place to make sure that this happens in as effective a manner as possible. And that's like lots of investments in software, lots of investments in processes and systems. That same year, we also invested a lot in our hearing test software. So we launched another mobile version for it. We launched the first beta for our hearing check on the site. We made huge amounts of progress on an even more elaborate version of that hearing test that we would like to eventually offer in stores. And so, all of this, like, it kind of happened behind the curtains, right? You haven't launched a test yet, okay? And you haven't launched a new systems just yet. All of this is happening this year. But, as you kind of like grind through those development aspects and technology investment aspects, you feel that, okay, if we get a focus on this, we're making progress on this front, but we may not be making as much progress on the sales front, So progress ultimately comes in different shapes and forms, right? It's a very broad concept. I think a lot of people think that progress is just like, how quickly do you guys grow? Then, what are your sales figures? But sometimes like you have to measure your progress based on the steps that are required to eventually get to sales, So I think from that standpoint, like you just have to kind of like shift the perspective a bit,
Yep, excellent point. So it sounds like you are really busy with your team there, looking to get clinical trials, you're adding new people to the team, you're raising funding, you're hanging out with Richard Branson. So how do you find time to take time for yourself and just like find some balance in your life?
Yeah, look, I think at the end of the day, you have to be very, very disciplined about balance as well, right? I recall like in the early days, like a startup or a business is something that consumes you almost fully, right? You're in the days when you don't even have an office just yet. You work out of your home or out of, a coffee shop or so. And in those cases, like your personal sphere becomes your professional sphere and vice versa, right? And so at some point, this can become quite straining, and you need to be very, very self-aware and conscious that this is happening. And you have to be disciplined with yourself to understand when this happens and be able to draw very clear boundaries between what is work and what is your personal life, right? So it all starts there, okay? Once you kind of clear cut those boundaries, you can then shape your personal life in a way that allows you to recharge batteries. And so like, some of the things that like, obviously help me recharge batteries is, staying active. So it's making sure that I spend time with positive people, the people that I love. And at the end of the day, also do activities that allow me to reset, right? And regain focus, right? Oftentimes you find yourself in the trenches that can create a bit of a more isolated, encapsulated view of the world. And it's very, very important to like pierce that and see this from new perspectives, right? So activities like spending time with people that give you energy as opposed to consume energy, spend time meditating, thinking about what's really going on, and ultimately like really staying disciplined so that you have a feeling like you are in control of your life, And that's, I think, on that last point, that's probably the most important point of it all. Like you need to feel that you have ownership. You're already in a startup that is like all consuming and that is very volatile, and like, good things happen followed by bad things like in instants and back. And so that volatility can make you feel that you're not in full control of what's going on. Okay. And, you need to counteract that. You need to make sure that this feeling of lack of control doesn't like waft over into your personal life, So it all starts with self-awareness. It all starts with, feeling that you're the master of your destiny,
Great. I love that. Feel like you are the master of your destiny. So let's go ahead and close out with a parting piece of guidance from you for us.
I think at the end of the day, you've got to do what is your calling, right? You need to stay very, very true to what drives you. If entrepreneurship is something that is like an itch that you just need to go after, then do it. And don't overanalyze and paralyze yourself by all the possible like downside scenarios out there. And just like go for it, like take that first step, collect data, like observe, process it, and iterate from then on, Look at it as a blank canvas that at some point you need to start painting on. Just like, it doesn't matter what, just start somewhere, okay? But you have to do this because it feels right for you, not because it feels right for someone else, or or because you have other drivers that aren't intrinsically about that. If you do this for the money or if you do this for the fame, this is going to be a very, very short-lived affair.
Yeah, very important. So find your calling and stay true to what drives you. I hope today's episode inspires you to think more about how you can find your passion and live your best life. For more information, including links to resources that Patrick and I chatted about today and how best to get in touch with him, head on over to our website, theboostpodcast.com, and check out our show notes from this episode and catch the Boost bonus. Patrick, I want to thank you for sharing your journey with us today. And remember, anything is possible for you.
Now that you've completed this episode, the next step is to join the Boost Squad for strategic insights, tips, and tricks, as well as exclusive resources designed specifically to accelerate your personal and professional growth. All this and more is waiting for you at theboostpodcast.com.